Okay, so let me start off with how well or badly do voters think Brexit is going. And is in particular any reason to anticipate, given voters' reactions, that maybe they might have changed their minds about Brexit? Well, and I'm going to use a whole variety of polls and data that I've collected with NatSen. So this is a very kind of Catholic approach to looking at the data. So number one is, well, is there any, we are actually probably a little bit more pessimistic now than we were at the beginning of the Brexit process. This is all the readings that YouGov have had, many of them, asking people whether or not the UK economy will be better or worse off as a result of leaving the EU. The green line is those who think it's worse off. The blue line says it's better. And as you can see, the blue line has kind of sunk a wee bit and the green line has risen a little bit. So it looks as though, actually, if anything, we were always relatively pessimistic about the economic consequence of Brexit during the referendum, but it seems that maybe that's developed a little bit further. Very similar finding from the question that I've been running on the NatSen panel. As you can see, most recent reading, 52%, reckoning that the economy will be worse off as compared with 48% 12 months previously, and that those figures all seem to be rather higher than when NatSen asked about it before the referendum. Rather more dramatic, however, is what happens when you ask people, as I've done on the NatSen panel, well, what do you think, how good or bad or deal do you think the UK is going to get out of this process? Well, even back in February of last year, we were kind of slightly pessimistic, but at least it was almost evenly balanced. But as you can see, we've become increasingly pessimistic about what kind of deal we're going to get out of the European Union. Equally, shall we say, since a certain rather catastrophic event in June, the public's confidence in the way in which the UK government is handling Brexit has also fallen away. Actually, this slide shows you kind of the two crucial events. The Lancaster House speech of almost exactly 12 months ago did Theresa May a lot of good in laying out at least a rough idea of what she wanted out of Brexit, and particularly making it clear that she didn't want to be in the single market because of the freedom of movement requirements. Having done that, pretty rapidly thereafter, people's views about how the government was handling Brexit improved quite markedly. But then she fought a general election and failed to win, and in the wake of that, our confidence in the government's handling has fallen away. That's ORB's reading. YouGov's, one of the more regular readings, is a slightly more difficult picture to read. But as you can see, you take the green line, which is those who think that the UK government's handling things badly. It improved during the spring, particularly after Lancaster House. It was almost kind of again 50-50 during the general election campaign, but subsequently criticism of the UK government's handling has improved markedly. So at first blush, there seems every reason to anticipate that maybe the UK public have indeed changed their minds about Brexit, because they're certainly none too optimistic about what the fallout from the process is going to be. However, maybe not however. What's also intriguing about what's happened is that the process that's been going on is not a case of a bunch of Remoaners going, oh, this really is going to be absolutely awful. This is a disaster. And Remoaners becoming uniquely, particularly more critical of the government. Actually, if anything, it is those who voted Leave who have now become rather more critical of the government. So, for example, notice here the very sharp drop. This is data from NatSen's mixed mode panel. There's a 23-point drop between February and October in the proportion of people who thought that Leave voters who thought the UK would get a good deal. Equally, if we look at the data on what Remain and Leave voters think about the government's handling of the process, the increase in YouGov's data in the proportion who think the government's handling badly is rather greater amongst Leave voters than it is amongst Remain voters. And a very similar story is told by the NatSen mixed mode panel. Which, of course, you could therefore mean, well, this therefore perhaps strengthens the argument even further that actually voters the distribution of preferences about the EU referendum might have changed, because if it's Leave voters in particular, who I think now have increasingly come to the view that this is not going to be a good outcome, maybe they have finally seen the light and the error of their ways, and they are now going to follow the path of Remain righteousness. However, just one other statistic, and this is a question that, rather perhaps remarkably, none of the commercial polls have asked, but I have been tracking in the research I've been doing with Nat Sen. And that is not only asking people how well you think the UK is handling the negotiations, but how well do you think the European Union is handling the negotiations? And as you can see, actually, we've never, unsurprisingly perhaps, never been thought the European Union is doing that well. But actually, our criticism of how the EU's handling negotiations has also increased. And by the way, it's increased amongst Remain voters as well amongst Leave voters. In other words, perhaps what we're looking at here, rather than people going, oh dear, I've made a mistake, is perhaps people are saying, you know what, we told you what to do and you're failing to deliver. And the fault lies on both sides of the negotiating table. And clearly, if voters have become more critical of the EU, as well as of the UK's handling the Brexit process, then maybe we shouldn't presume that they have now decided to follow the path of Remain righteousness. So let's then look a little more at what people say they would do when asked how they would do it in a second referendum. Now, actually, quite remarkably, there aren't that many polls out there asking people how they would vote in the EU referendum. And quite a few of those that are asked don't quite ask people, give people the exact question that was asked in June 2016 and then asking whether they vote Remain or Leave. That said, we've got enough evidence to get some idea of what's going on. So here, first of all, is just putting together a whole variety of different polling companies, mostly Survation, but not entirely, which have asked a question about the referendum, a second referendum, other than asking simply, should the UK remain or leave the European Union? The green, and I've taken the don't knows here because the don't knows fluctuate between companies, so this is kind of to clarify matters. The green line is the proportion of people who say they would vote Leave. The blue line is the proportion who say they would vote Remain. And what I invite you to note, particularly if you leave the entries very, very early, immediately after the EU referendum, is that up to and including the UK general election campaign, the green line tended to be just above the blue line, i.e. we were pretty much replicating the result of the EU referendum in June 2016, whereas basically since the beginning of July, on the occasions that a kind of non-standard question has been asked, the blue line has been a little bit above the green line. Not exactly a dramatic change, but of course we don't need a dramatic change for the outcome of a second EU referendum to be different from that of the first EU referendum. So, exhibit number one suggests maybe, perhaps there is something going on here. As for polling companies that have actually asked the question that appeared on the ballot paper without any adornment or embellishment, the best series has actually been provided by BMG. They didn't publish it for a long time, then all of a sudden they put it all up on the web. So this is simply asking people, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the EU or should it leave the European Union? Again, the blue line are the proportion who say Remain, the green line say the proportion who say Leave, and basically up to and again including the election, Leave were at least never behind Remain. We had a few equalities. But since the election, Remain have never been behind Leave. It's again very, very close. It's a subtle movement. Don't get too excited by the tick on the far right-hand side. BMG research will tell you don't get too excited about that for reasons that I'm going to come to. But the broad story is, again, maybe it looks as though there's a little wee bit of a shift. Again, YouGov's Eurotracker series shows a very similar trend. I haven't bothered to show you that. But equally, also, you can read much the same interpretation into the rather more occasional readings, and these have only taken since the general election by Survation. Survation's polling again tends to find post-election Remain slightly ahead of Leave. However, probably the most widely known measure of where we stand on the merits of Brexit since the referendum is the question that YouGov are asking on a very regular basis. In hindsight, do you think Britain was right or wrong to leave the European Union, which we might regard as a reasonable surrogate for the how people might vote in the referendum a second time around? And certainly, again, it tells a very similar story. Now, with so many readings, you do get the odd exception to the rule, and of course, that also always means that the moment you get a YouGov poll that's slightly different from what most YouGov polls have said recently, the Twitterati get overly excited. But if you look at the broad mix, basically, again, up to and including the general election, the blue line, which is those who think that Brexit was right, tends normally to be above the green line, which are those who think that Brexit was wrong, whereas certainly since the beginning of the autumn of last year, usually the green line has been ahead of the blue line, although interestingly in the most recent YouGov poll it was the other way around. But until we get a lot more polls saying that, we shouldn't read too much into that. That again probably is the exception rather than the rule. So however you look at it, it looks as though perhaps there's been a bit of a shift, and maybe a bit of a shift that perhaps in a second EU referendum, the outcome would be different. Although, of course, at this point, I do have to, in all honesty, to remind folk that at least of the final EU referendum polls, 4 had Remain ahead and only 2 had Leave ahead, yet Remain still won. So given we are talking figures of around 51-49, 52-48, which was indeed pretty close to the average of the opinion polls on June the 23rd, 2016, we shouldn't get too excited about the movement. The other reason for not getting too excited is to actually look underneath the bonnet and look at what's going on so far as the transfer of loyalties is concerned. So the columns denote how people voted in the 2016 referendum, and the rows indicate how each of the 3 groups, the Remain voters, the Leave voters, and those who did not vote in 2016, now say they would vote. And what I've done to construct this is I've taken the average of the most recent BMG poll, the ICM poll, the famous one in The Guardian, the most recent Survation poll, and also the most recent NATSA mixed mode panel, all of which have both data on how people voted in 2016 and how they say they would vote now. Now, what I invite you to note, first of all, is that yes, the proportion of Leave voters who say they would vote Leave again is a little bit below the proportion of Remain voters who say they will Remain again, but it's not exactly a vast difference. It's only 4 points. Certainly what is not true, certainly according to this collection of data, is that Leave voters are markedly more likely now to have switched sides than are Remain voters. 8% of Leave voters now say they would vote Remain, and 7% of Remain voters now say they would vote Leave. So evidently this is not clearly simply a case of widespread regret amongst those who voted for Brexit. Actually, what seems to be going on are 2 things. First is that Leave voters are just a bit more likely to say, God, I went to the polls last time. That was a bit of a miracle, I mean, I don't usually bother to make it. And you really think I'm going to turn out and do this again? You've got another thing coming. The second thing, however, and probably, not as surprising, is that those who abstained, who, of course, were disproportionately younger voters, because whatever the arguments about a youthquake in June of last year, there wasn't a youthquake in June 2016. BSA data suggests that turnout amongst younger people rose a little bit more than the rest of the population, but not very much. So given that younger voters are more keen on Remain, what we discover is that amongst those who didn't vote in 2016, there is a clear majority in favour of Remain. So in other words, it looks as though the outcome of a second EU referendum at the moment would hinge on the relative willingness of Remain and Leave supporters to turn out. We know that last time, in the end, Leave voters ended up being rather more inclined to turn out and vote, though probably not sufficiently to have been the determining factor. Maybe in a second referendum, Remain voters would be rather keener to turn out and vote, and maybe that would make the difference. But shall we say, if you are an ardent Remainer who is desperate to believe that a second EU referendum would definitely produce a different result, I think the honest answer that anybody can give you at the moment is we don't know. It's a 50-50 call, and probably would indeed depend on the pattern of turnout. Certainly, the polling evidence that we have so far does not indicate widespread regret amongst Leave voters for the choice that they made. But maybe just a little bit. I mean, here's just to kind of show you how the pattern now differs from the pattern a year ago. So I'm now using YouGov's in hindsight question in order to do the same kind of analysis. So the left-hand side is showing you the proportion of Remain voters, for example, who thought that Brexit was wrong, the proportion of Leave voters who thought it was right 12 months ago. And 12 months ago, 88% of Remain voters thought it was wrong, 89% of Leave voters thought it was right. Now, those figures are 85% of Leave voters thinking it's right, 88% of Remain voters. So again, you can see here, as I showed you in the previous table, just a very, very slight diminution in the enthusiasm of Leave voters for Leave, but it's a very slight diminution. And to get anything that's close to statistical significance, you have to put I put a whole load of polls together, by the way, to get to these figures. But it's very, very slight. What, however, perhaps is also true, and this perhaps is something that we will pick up in the next session. One of the things that I presume that somebody is going to say later on is that the division between the extent to which Remain and Leave voters voted, they divided during the general election. Remain voters tended to move towards Labour more heavily than did Leave voters, and certainly the Conservatives lost ground amongst Remain voters while gaining it amongst Leave voters. So that's the story we know up to June of last year. What this slide tries to do is to try and see whether or not there is any reason to believe that that process has continued further in the subsequent 6 months. Now, it's not exactly overwhelming, but shall we say there's a little bit of evidence in support of that proposition. So now, whereas in June of 2017, 69% of those who thought, according to YouGov's question, that Brexit was right, said that they voted Conservative. That figure now stands at 72%. And equally, whereas the Labour Party was getting the support of 65% of those who voted who thought that Brexit was wrong, that figure's gone up to 69%. Now, there are all sorts of things to be going on here. It could be that Remain and Leave voters are just gradually sorting themselves into Conservative and Labour voters, or it could be that existing Conservative voters have been persuaded of the merits of Brexit after all. These data doesn't enable us to distinguish between those two things. But certainly, one of the things to be aware as we go through the next 6 months, that the Labour Party does have a very, very different electorate on the issue of Brexit than does the Conservative Party. Leaving aside what exact stance the Labour Party decides to take, it's clearly very clear that it's in its electoral interest, despite the minority of its voters who voted Leave, to at least to be in a softer position than the Conservative Party on Brexit, and that it may be that the Labour Party now needs to realise that its electorate is perhaps even more pro-Remain now than certainly it was at the time of the referendum in June 2016, and maybe even at the time of the general election. Anyway, I'll leave that one for Jeremy Corbyn to think about. Now, what about my third question, which is, do we want another referendum? Now, there's frankly not a lot of evidence in support of the idea that there has been a dramatic increase in support for a second referendum of the kind that The Guardian was trying to claim 10 days ago. The question that the ISM, the Guardian reporting was the first time it was asked, and I'll show you in a moment why it might have come up with different answers. So this, first of all, is the time series from Opinion, who have been asking a question about having a second referendum for quite regularly. And the green line are the proportion of people who don't think that there should be a second referendum. And frankly, it's difficult to make a great deal of sense of the evidence from that time series. If we look at YouGov's somewhat shorter time series, you can look at it and go, well, maybe there's been a couple of points increase in the support for a second EU referendum. It probably wouldn't pass the test of statistical significance. But frankly, it's pretty marginal stuff. But of course, one of the things that perhaps has been rather lacking and underappreciated in such polling about a second referendum that has been conducted is that, of course, there is more than one kind of second referendum that we could possibly have. I've thought of 4 here, and I think subsequently I thought there might be another one, but I've probably forgotten about what it is again, but somebody can just tell me. Clearly, one possible referendum we could have is deal versus no deal, which is what we might call the Theresa May variant of what she thinks the parliamentary vote's going to be about. On the other hand, there is the Liberal Democrat view as to what a second referendum should be about, which is the deal versus we stop Brexit. And the default, the no option means we stay inside the EU. There is then perhaps what the more pragmatic pro-leavers would accept, which is that we have a referendum which we vote on the terms, but if we say no, we then go back with the tail between our legs and go back to the European Union and say, I'm terribly sorry, but actually our folk aren't terribly keen on what we've negotiated. Could we please start again? And finally, of course, we could just simply have a referendum that's just a rerun of the one that we had in June 2016. We could even hold it now if we wanted to do so, without going through the painful process of negotiation with the European Union, and see whether or not we really actually want to do it or not. So these are 4 different types of referendum. And clearly, you might, if you are Ramona, deal versus stop Brexit sounds like a brilliant idea. But deal versus no deal sounds like the worst possible choice with which you could present me. So the truth is, therefore, actually we need a rather great degree of subtlety in the questions that has been evident so far. Here, however, the noble Lord Ashcroft has, to some degree at least, risen to the rescue, or ridden to the rescue. He's not quite got those 4 distinguishing characteristics, but he certainly has done enough to show that the kind of referendum matters. So on the left-hand side is what people said. Well, he just simply said, do you want another referendum? Do you want to go through the whole process again? Without any reference to negotiations. And clear majority against. And he asked these to 4 different parts of his sample. Second, he said, well, it was a question that said, well, look, should we have a new referendum on whether we continue with the Brexit process? So it was a kind of slightly more reference to the process than just simply a second bite at the cherry. Again, a majority against, but slightly weaker. Then we come to the Liberal Democrat referendum, which is whether we have deal versus stay. And actually here, the balance of opinion is pretty even. And then when we come to deal versus no deal, well, the balance of opinion of those who are willing to express a view is actually in favour. The government might wish to note. Though the truth is, at this point, a lot of voters went, what? You mean to say you're going to ask me to choose between which cliff I'm going to jump over? You know what? I don't know which cliff is the better one to jump over. And we get a very large level of don't knows. But anyway, and one thing to note is that it's leave vote. And this is quite a non-trivial point. The fact that the referendum on the right-hand side is more popular than the referendum on the left-hand side is not because Remain voters take a different view of the different referendums. For the most part, they don't. It's Leave voters who do, because surprise, surprise, Leave voters think deal versus no deal is quite a good idea as a referendum, all right? On the other hand, going through the whole process again, without any reference to negotiations, Leave voters think, actually, this really is a bad idea. So we should therefore be careful. If you see an opinion poll that says there's now a majority in favour of a second referendum, well, A, work out which referendum it was, but B, look at the underlying numbers. Such polls are not necessary evidence that Remain voters in particular are desperate to go back to the polls. There may actually be an acceptance by Leave voters that the referendum may not be a bad idea. Therefore, I showed you Opinion and I showed you YouGov earlier, and I showed you because of the relative lack of trend. In both cases, I also said there wasn't support for a referendum. However, of course, we had the ICM poll last Saturday, which said actually there is a majority in favour, and they are not alone. Survation also in their last poll had a majority in favour. Actually, note, Survation had a slightly bigger majority in favour of a second referendum than did the ICM one. So an alternative reading to the ICM poll is support for second referendum slipped, The Guardian, please note. But anyway, of course, that would be an utterly invalid comparison to make. But clearly here, it's also clear that actually, Lord Ashcroft has shown that it makes a difference, what referendum you refer to. Apparently also, the questions the companies have been asking also give us different answers. Now, at this point, you have to get into some quite careful textual exegesis as to exactly the question that's being asked. And in truth, if you go through the process, as you can see, for example, Opinium's question and ICM's questions in some sense look rather similar to each other. They both seem to be about a referendum on whether we take the deal or whether we leave. It's a kind of Liberal Democrat, or Remain. It's a Liberal Democrat kind of referendum. So you might therefore say, well, it's rather surprising that these two polling companies get very different answers. What I think the differences between the companies suggest is it also depends literally how you describe the referendum process. Notice that ICM said the public should have the chance to take a final decision. This is putting power in the hands of voters. Whereas YouGov, for example, said, do you think there should be another referendum? Well, who wants a referendum? Nobody wants a referendum. They might want to be able to go out and vote and say what they think about the deal, but they're not necessarily terribly keen on a referendum. All right? And so therefore, actually just describing what the referendum is and the extent to which it focuses on the public being the arbiter of the process, as opposed to, well, you might have a choice, or we might have this funny thing called a referendum. And again, intriguingly here, it is Leave voters in particular who are sensitive to the question wording. Give Leave voters the opportunity to vote on a referendum on whether they accept or reject the deal, which is what Survation says. Some of them go, you know what, that's quite a good idea. Because at the end of the day, I think the UK government is going to come up with a completely crap deal, and therefore it would be quite good to have a referendum on that, and therefore we get out without a deal. Right? As we saw, is also true of the Ashcroft polling. But again, notice, although the Guardian managed to get the Remain voters slightly keener on an EU referendum, for the most part, again, even there, it's the behaviour, or it's the preferences of Leave voters that are driving the process as much as that of everybody else. What, of course, is also true, however, just to make a crucial point, in exactly the same way as Conservative and Labour voters now have very different views about the merits of Brexit, they also have very different views about the merits of a second referendum. And although Opinion, YouGov, ICM and Survation disagree about the overall level of support for a second referendum, they all agree that it's a relatively popular proposition amongst Labour voters. Why? Because, of course, it's a relatively popular proposition amongst Remain voters, and Remain voters are predominantly Labour voters. Again, Jeremy Corbyn, please note. So, to conclude, voters are increasingly critical of the Brexit process and how it's being handled, but they are critical of everybody. They're not just critical of the UK government. They're not just saying that therefore this was a bad idea. And the increase in criticism in particular is more marked amongst Leave voters. Still, there is at best only limited evidence of a swing to Remain, and much of it is occasioned by movement into and out of what we might call abstention. Equally, there's a bit, but it's inconsistent evidence of greater support for another referendum. But here, the answers depend on the question wording, including, not least, what kind of ballot is envisaged, a distinction that, to be honest, at the moment, too little account's been taken of in the questions that have been asked about a second referendum. And the truth is that the one thing we can really say about attitudes towards Brexit is that this country is divided down the middle. And the truth is this country was divided down the middle 18 months ago, and not a great deal has changed, except that that division is perhaps becoming increasingly reflected in the views of the supporters of the Conservative and the Labour Party. Well, I showed you that we've probably become a little bit more pessimistic about the economic consequences of Brexit, but it's not dramatic. The reason, what's the principal reason why living standards have fallen? Because the pound's been marked down. Who's marked the pound down? The forces of international capitalism, who probably do Leave voters not necessarily regard as a particularly good arbiter of the merits of their vote, the forces of international capitalism. So you can see how the one effect that's happened may be regarded by Leave supporters as the Remain side marking their own homework. Yes, because the piece I've contributed to the report that's probably in your hands it was indeed about the question of attitudes towards immigration. To cut a long story short, I make 2 points. If you ask the British public whether questions, give them propositions about what they want to come out of Brexit that are not about the trade-off, but just simply asking people, for example, the question I've asked most often is, would you like the Brexit agreement to include a requirement for EU citizens that wish to come to the UK to live and work to have to apply to do so, which is a proposition which basically is, against freedom of movement. Now, Leave voters are keener on the proposition than our Remain voters, but a majority of Remain voters are also in favour of that proposition. And I think it's certainly a mistake to presume that the level of support for freedom of movement is the 48% support that there was for Remain in the referendum. Again, the research that I and others have done shows that quite a few people voted Remain despite rather than because of their views about freedom movement. So that's number one. Number two, it's very difficult to find any sign that when you ask that kind of question, that attitudes have shifted. What perhaps there is some evidence of is that when you ask people then the trade-off question, which is, which matters more, control of immigration or access to the single market, that access to the single market is a slightly more popular priority and maybe it's become a wee bit more popular. But the truth is, for Leave voters, it's the predominant concern is still controlling immigration. And I think the honest truth is that it's very, very difficult to see how any UK government can emerge out of the Brexit negotiations retaining our membership of the single market for so long as membership of the single market implies accepting the freedom of movement provisions. This, in effect, is the crucial bind that makes this resolving Brexit so difficult. And all the difficulties about Brexit flow from, frankly, the reason why Brexit is happening in the first place, all flows from this. So, it's difficult at the moment to argue, and particularly given the views of Leave voters, that a UK government is going to be able to accept freedom of movement, and that therefore, unless the EU changes its mind, we're out the single market. One's best guess for the reason of discontent comes from the shape of the Times series. The Times series essentially says, as I said, when Theresa May gave her Lancaster House speech 12 months ago, confidence in what the UK government was doing arose. Then we had a general election which the Conservatives failed to win, and confidence basically fell back again. That suggests to me that basically we are, as is so often true in politics, this is about people's broad conception of whether it sounds as though the government knows what the hell it's up to. All right? And that with the Lancaster House speech, people got some sense, okay, so that's what it's all going to mean. Well, okay, at least it sounds as though the government knows what it's trying to achieve. Well, then, of course, we had a general election in which, shall we say, quite a few people's confidence in the ability of the Prime Minister to deliver anything, let alone Brexit, took something of a hit. And almost undoubtedly against the backdrop of that experience, and then, of course, the government having to scrabble with the DUP, etc., people are saying, well, hang on, I'm not quite sure these guys are doing terribly well at all. And, of course, it's then also true, of course, the Phase 1 process did take rather longer than it was supposed to. It probably proved rather more difficult than it was supposed to in the end, and to be honest, for both sides. And we are now looking at a rather short timetable to deliver what is meant to be the meat of the thing, which is between March and October of this year. So you can see, I think, why people might go, hang on. Now, equally, why might people think the EU are doing something badly? Well, again, because they think the process is all rather slow and rather cumbersome and rather difficult. But also, they may just feel that the European Union is frankly trying to crack too hard a deal. But these are all guesses. It's not based on detailed statistical analysis about what do you think about the Brexit process is or isn't going right. To be honest, I don't think anybody's asked those kind of questions, or I might be correct. One suspects at the moment that mood of many of a voter is we're on the Titanic and we're just wondering whether we're going to end up in New York or in a rather cold sea off Iceland, and we're not quite sure as to what's going to happen. But the trouble is we're on the Titanic and we're not even sure whether the captain of the ship isn't going to suffer a mutiny halfway across the Atlantic. But that, to be honest, as ordinary passengers, there isn't a great deal we can do about it. I mean, this is kind of how I would characterise where we're at. Now, whether or not that is sustained, and whether or not at some point in the next 6 months, the apparent stasis is changed, and there is a sudden change, and people go, hang on, this is a really daft idea after all. Conversely, actually, the toughness of negotiations just goes to show that the European Union really is a crap institution and we should get out of it as fast as possible. I mean, who knows? But certainly what I would say, and kind of a crucial lesson for the Remain side, is that the presumption that public opinion will be shifted by arguments of well, you know what, it's all terribly difficult to get out of the European Union. There are all these kind of intricacies and difficulties you hadn't really thought of, doesn't cut the mustard. Telling people that it's rather difficult to get out of the European Union, who want to get out of the European Union, is a reason in their view as to why we should be getting out of the European Union, because it's a darn awkward institution that meddles far too much in British life. All right? And so I think the Remain side, if they want to shift public opinion, really have to think about the things that actually are central to this. And that, and to be honest, is either changing views about the economy, which is one question, or otherwise changing views about immigration. If there's stuff in the commercial polling data on this subject, Carol, it's pretty thin. And to be honest, I've not bothered to look at it. I don't know if anybody else... Have you been having a go? Yeah.
We did some work on different scenarios and looking at sort of different trade-offs and whether it mattered, this started. So that the final deal started in 19, in 21, in 23, and it made very little difference.
Yeah. I mean...
But I think the crucial thing is do people feel it is going to happen, or that this is just an excuse for it not happening?
Yeah. But there isn't a great deal kicking around, to be honest. It's an insider's subject again. It's like the civil service. My honest answer to you is I hope not. But I don't think I can say more. I don't know if you want to say anything about Denmark, Sarah.
It's a slightly selective presentation of what happened in Denmark. This was, in fact, the extreme left. The split in British society is far deeper than what we've seen in similar referendums in Denmark over Brexit. And I do think that would... that would not necessarily be more likely to heal if there was a second referendum and one that perhaps narrowly was a Remain vote.
Yeah.
Because I think you could, arguably, a lot of people would probably feel on the Leave side then that they were cheated. And especially since that some of the concerns amongst Leave voters have to do with the sort of anti-establishment feeling. So if there was let's say, a 52-48 referendum, you could arguably say that people would feel this was an elite stitch-up. But I think the parallel to Denmark here is a little problematic, the way you portrayed it.
Yeah, Sarah took the words out of my mouth as I passed to her in order to have time to think. But I think it'd come at it slightly differently, irrespective of whether we do in the end leave, or whether at some point in the next 2.5 years we change our minds. Politicians have one substantial job to do to bring this society back together. The debate about Europe isn't just a debate about some relatively remote institution. It's a fundamental debate about our attitudes towards the international capitalism. And one section of society that feels it does very nicely out of it, thanks very much, and thinks it's a brilliant idea, and the other half of our society saying it sucks and we don't like the consequences, both economically and in terms of immigration. And that division is going to have to be dealt with by future UK governments, irrespective of the outcome of the EU referendum, because there are a lot of people, irrespective of what happens, who are going to be are certainly deeply unhappy about the status quo, and will be looking for the status quo on some of these issues to be changed. I mean, I think there's been the occasional polling question has attempted to say to people, would you still be willing to get out of the European Union even if you thought you'd be worse off? And the answer of some people to that is yes. I mean, the honest truth is that the position at the time of the EU referendum was that most Leave voters went, it ain't going to make any difference economically, one way or the other, and we're unhappy about immigration and about sovereignty, so therefore that's what tipped them. Remain voters, in contrast, were saying, no, actually, we are going to be worse off. It certainly is interesting as to whether or not, to what extent the Leave vote would peel away, if indeed there were to be a decline in the British economy of a kind that was sufficiently manifest that people actually notice. But, unless I, have misunderstood the leak incorrectly, are we not still talking about, on the Remain side, of the economy just not growing as much as would otherwise be the case? And given that as otherwise would be the case is something we will never ever experience if we do leave the European Union, who the hell is ever going to know that actually we are worse off? Whereas, of course, the 350 million quid that goes across to Brussels every week is money going out the door now and is a much sharper, clearer message. So at the moment, at least, until actually there is clear evidence that actually leaving the European Union really is hitting people in the pocket in a way that they're not just going to simply blame on the international financial markets, then probably it ain't going to shove things. I mean, to be honest, if you the one thing that I think really could shift it, right, and this is why at the end of the day, the ball in some sense is in the European Union's court, not in the UK government's court. The one thing that I think that would shift it is if we were to have an agreement for an emergency break on freedom of movement, we'd be in a different ballgame. But then if we'd had an emergency break on freedom of movement out of the February 2016 European Council, we wouldn't have a majority vote for Brexit in the first place. So a fundamental change in the policy stance on immigration that gave people some sense that actually there would be a degree of control, I think would shift the numbers. And it's, as it were, rather easier to make a dramatic gesture, at least theoretically it's easier to make a dramatic gesture. Politically, ideologically, it isn't. But theoretically, it's easier to make a dramatic gesture in that area than it probably is on the economy. It's no secret that those who voted Leave are disproportionately those who are less interested in politics. They're certainly not those who are going to be following the web in order to find the latest report on the European Council, etc., etc. Sure. And they're going to tend to be less knowledgeable about the intricate details of the European Union. That doesn't, in my view, make their views less valid. The problem at the end of the day in this country, so for those of you who are in favour of staying inside the EU, actually is not a question of knowledge. The fundamental problem, in my view, is that the European Union project in this country in the last 40 years has failed to instill the idea that Europe is us rather than other. Only around 1 in 8 people in this country actually think of themselves as being European. Therefore, our attitudes towards the European Union has always been a transactional one. We're in it for what we think we can get out of it. We'll stay in it for so long as we think it's in our interest. The problem is, as a result of the historical experience of immigration in the last 15 years, that a small majority of people decided 18 months ago that it's no longer, the game is no longer worth the candle. But if we had the sense that, and therefore the arguments about sovereignty work because we don't think that Brussels is part of us. If in the last 40 years we had come to feel European, that sovereignty argument would have not had the same sway. So I would suggest to you at the end of the day, the problem here is not a question of knowledge, it's a problem of identity. Well, I mean, the short answer to it, 2 points to make. I mean, the short answer to, of course, is they've not had as much impact as they would like. One of the fascinating, if you go and, go to UKIP meetings or hear the rhetoric on the Leave side, big business indeed is regarded as one of the part of the forces of international capitalism that they don't like. Of course, the rhetoric is that big business are using immigration as an easy and cheap labour supply that makes it more difficult for British workers to get jobs and to get high wages, and also provides them with a ready supply of nannies to look after their children. I'm sorry if it offends anybody, but this is the perspective that many on the Leave side will have about the active workers. On the other hand, they will argue that we're in favour of small business because small business had to deal with all the EU regulation, but doesn't necessarily engage in exports. Right? So that's point one. Big business, of course, also number two, is not amongst the most trusted of professions. It kind of tends to come in the middle of Maury's, trust group. So it's not necessarily the most popular institutions. But of course, the third thing about big business, and the kind of fascinating thing about the Brexit debate in the UK at the moment, is that most of big business still seems to think that the risks of Jeremy Corbyn are greater than the risks of Brexit. But it is a fascinating question as to whether or not this is true, all right? Because certainly what is true, and what I'm not sure big business has kind of quite woken up to, is that the electorate, the Conservative electorate now, is miles away from big business in its attitude towards how the UK economy is run. The Conservative Party has essentially a protectionist electorate. And the classic argument that's kept on going on inside the Conservative Party for over 100 years between protectionists and free traders is being played out once again inside the Conservative Party, but the protectionists are currently in the ascendant, which does therefore mean that this incredible discontinuity between the views of big business, who are the traditional Conservative Party's paymasters, and actually the views of most Conservative voters. And that's a fascinating tension, how it's been played out. In contrast, actually, it's the party of the centre-left, and for some people's views, the party of the not-so-centre-left, that seems at the moment more inclined to maintain the institutions of international capitalism. Isn't it wonderful? It's a fascinating debate. But you can see why big business find themselves in a somewhat awkward position. I kind of wonder why some of them just don't go, well, hang on, we just sell the utilities down the river, who cares, in order to rescue the rest of big business, because we'll accept a little bit of nationalisation in return for being inside the EU, but they're not there yet. Because if you live in London, which is this extraordinary multicultural, multi-ethnic part of the world, where there's not just EU migration, but all sorts of migration, and you are talking about a population which is incredibly young and incredibly well educated, you know what? They think it's wonderful. They think this city is superb, all right? Because they have the prior predisposition and they live in a city where this is just normal. But go outside of London and go outside of some of the metropolitan centres, places, particularly places down the east coast of England, which are experiencing substantial migration for the first time. And this is partly the consequence of the nature of the migration. A lot of the migration we know has been generated by the hospitality industry. The hospitality industry is very widely dispersed. But the result of this is that therefore we're getting inward migration to parts of the country that are not particularly economically affluent or particularly dynamic, that for whom largely the waves of Commonwealth immigration pass them by, but they do now have Polish plumbers and Polish fruit pickers on their buses next door, etc., and they're going, hang on, this is not the country I was brought out. So it's places for where immigration is a relatively new experience, where you are going to get the most in the way of cultural reaction. So that's why the patterns are as they are. On the last point, they are much more nuanced than you might imagine, and they don't fit either an EU, non-EU, or a Commonwealth, non-Commonwealth distinction. Basically, if they're from Australia, Canada, or New Zealand, please come in. You're our brothers and sisters. If you're coming from Germany and France, it's, well, I suppose you're all right. And Denmark's probably in that category as well. If it's Romania, no thanks. If it's Bangladesh, we aren't even going to let you on the plane. Okay, so in other words, and you can think about some of the things that might underlie this. But basically, white immigration from English-speaking countries, either because it's the main language or because the professionals from those countries speak English fine, because people feel there's a sense of cultural similarity. All right, but populations from other more diverse backgrounds, more difficult. So origin matters, but it doesn't matter in the way that you might think. To be honest, from the work, I was recently looking at a lot of stuff on attitudes towards immigration, and certainly what immigration policy should be. I think if you want to win the argument on immigration, what you've got to trade is numbers for control. It looks to me, at the end of the day, the thing that the British public are looking for is some sense that we have some ability to decide who can and who cannot come here. And that the problem at the moment is that at the end of the day, the freedom of movement rules mean that we just don't have that ability. And because, of course, this is the irony of the whole situation, because, ironically, back in 2004, we were more Europhile than virtually every other EU state, apart from Ireland and Sweden, and said, it's fine, you can come, we welcome you. Of course, we don't expect you to come, and then you did, and the whole story flows from there. So it's a sense, it's people's sense, and again, because again, the government said they were going to get net migration down and failed, it's the sense of a lack of control that's the problem. So you probably, it doesn't look as though people are saying, oh, shouldn't we have any migrants? They probably would like it to be rather lower than it is at the moment, because the truth, again, we have to remember here, the UK historically is a net exporter of population. The experience of the last 15 years is unusual, which kind of does raise questions about why is it that industry is apparently so dependent on a non-domestic labour market in a way that historically has not necessarily been true. That's a challenge for your side to think about. If you can come up with something that gives people some sense of control and also means that access to welfare is not too generous for relatively newly arrived migrants, which again may cause trouble from your point of view because it'll make the UK a less attractive destination, you probably then can persuade people of the merits of a reasonable level of net migration. Of course, one of the things that we do know happens, of course, is that, when the person who speaks with a Polish accent first arrives, you get a reaction. If they've been your neighbours for 20 years and you've got to know their kids and their kids speak with an English accent of some description or other, rather than a Polish accent, then people will gradually accommodate this population. So again, and again, clearly a society probably, this country probably will be willing to accept a reasonable continuing level of net inward migration, so long as there's a sense of control, and probably also that it continues to be at what have been the relatively high levels at the moment, so that therefore you're actually giving the population some opportunity to accommodate themselves culturally to the social change that immigration brings. Because again, I think the thing we have to remember here is that all economists might want to argue that goods and labour should be equally freely tradable. People come with social externalities in a way that's not necessarily true of international trade in goods. And that, I think, again, is the problem that we are facing, that in an increasingly globalised world, and in a country which, for all sorts of reasons, has been experiencing high levels of net inward migration. That has caused a reaction that you have to think about how you manage in order to be able to achieve the levels of migration that you would probably quite reasonably argue are required for not just the business sector but also for the public sector, given the ageing of our population.